All right. So today, one of our main goals is going to be looking at understanding psychological disorders. One of the main things we'll do is contrast the medical model of psychological disorders with the biopsychosocial approach to disordered behavior. And to really start understanding behavior, we have to really look at the past and look at how it has evolved and progressed and changed throughout the course of the years. We know from the prologue that we've been attempting to explain behavior since the beginning of man. We've even talked about this trephination process that was used when behavior was presumed to be explained by evil spirits or godlike powers. And the idea that a person could have these evil spirits be released through this trephination process was a very interesting technique when they would drill holes in the skulls of these individuals, as you can see by the archaeological evidence of the skulls and the tools that they used. Until the last 2 centuries, people were considered mad, crazy. They were sometimes caged in zoo-like conditions. They were given treatments that were very brutal and inhumane. And you can see some of these displayed in the pictures here. The picture that was right here, they actually believed that they could spin these individuals in a spinning chair and somehow align the imbalances, and they could be rid of their psychological illness. They used sensory deprivation techniques. They would cage them in the crib-like chambers where they could basically, were restrained and couldn't move. And what you see over here is very, very much like a, solitary confinement, the padded rooms, the straitjackets, those kinds of things. This brutal treatment was disliked by a majority of reformers, and they insisted that it wasn't demonic possession. It was a sickness of the mind, and it caused and the treatment with these inhumane conditions were only making the situation worse. And so when we look at the medical model, it was the idea that diseases have physical causes that can be treated, diagnosed, treated, and in cases mostly cured. And this led to the institution of hospitals and those kinds of facilities that were, mostly like insane asylums. They were replaced by the 1980s by mental hospitals. And so we see a change in attitude towards those with psychological disorders and looking at treating the illness. That's what the medical model really focuses on, is treating the illness and coming up with a plan to help them. And so mental hospitals still had a lot of their own problems. They were oftentimes understaffed, they were underfunded, but it did replace some of the brutal treatments that you saw previous to the 1800s. More recently, we approach mental illness and psychological disorders as an interaction between nature and nurture. We know that there are biological factors, there are genetic abnormalities, there are problems with individual genes, brain structure, and chemistry, but we also know that there are environmental influences, more the nurture side, stress, trauma, different things that happen in the environment that can allow for psychological disorders to take place. And then, of course, the influence of the sociocultural roles, expectations, and how cultures define normal and abnormal. One of the things that has really helped in the diagnosis process is what's called the DSM. The DSM is a diagnostic and statistic manual that is used to classify and give precise and consistent diagnoses. I actually needed to change this PowerPoint before I did the screencast and I forgot, because what you see here listed as the DSM-4 is actually outdated. The DSM-4 was replaced last May, so almost a year ago, by the DSM-5. And it's just a newer version of the same book with a few revisions. But what you guys need to walk away truly from this chapter is understanding that psychologists were unfortunately very inconsistent in their diagnoses before the DSM was instituted. What one person diagnosed, another person saw as normal. So what they do is they look at all of the different criteria and they can more consistently find symptoms that are consistent with different titles of different illnesses. What you see on this table are the different axes in the DSM. There's axis 1, which looks at whether or not there's a clinical syndrome present. And so they can define excuse me, criteria, and clinicians may select one or more symptoms with the different disorders. We are only talking about anxiety disorders, mood disorders, schizophrenia, personality disorders, and dissociative disorders. But if you look at axis 1, look at how many other categories there are. Some of them we've talked about. We've talked about some sexual disorders. We've talked about sleep disorders. We've talked about drug addiction. So we have talked about some of the other disorders in other chapters. Axis 2 looks at whether or not a personality disorder or some kind of cognitive delay is present. Axis 3 looks at, is there a medical condition present in addition to the psychological disorder, like diabetes or hypertension, arthritis. Axis 4 looks at whether or not there's environmental problems like school or housing issues. And axis 5 really breaks down how highly functioning or low functioning the individual is. If they score from 91 to 100, they have high functioning in a wide range of activities. 51 to 60, moderate symptoms that might affect their ability to function in society, and 1 to 10, they are in persistent danger of hurting themselves or others. One of the things that the book also talks about is what's called labeling effects. Labeling effects is something that we have to be very careful about. People who are given a diagnosis oftentimes don't want other people to know that they suffer from anxiety or from depression, or let's say they're autistic or they are have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because they don't want people to treat them differently. If they're still highly functioning and are able to be in mainstream society, they may not want people to know that they have a particular diagnosis, because they don't want the way people treat them to change. One of the ways that is demonstrated by this picture is taking a look at the individuals on this baseball team. You can see on their jerseys it says the word asylum. This is taken from back in history when they did have insane asylums. Well, if you look at these individuals, sometimes people draw the conclusion that the people playing baseball, the ones in the uniforms, are actually members of the insane asylum. And the people standing in the back are the coaches, and that they are the staff members. When in all actuality, every single person that you see listed in this photograph is staff from the insane asylum from New York. And people just look at the way people during this time period have their facial expressions, and they assume that they actually are patients, when in fact they are all staff members. And so given that label of asylum, it changes maybe your perception of the picture. So the labeling effect is defined as when labels can stigmatize a person by biasing others' interpretations and perceptions of past and present behaviors, and by affecting the way people react to the labeled person. Everybody really ultimately in the end wants to be treated the same.